Good morning. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson, and we're continuing our introduction to the book of Mark today. Today we want to talk about authorship. When you read an introduction to the book of Mark, or you're looking in your study Bible, it will always point out that there's no signature in the book of Mark, but I think there sort of is a signature in the book of Mark, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But in the other Gospels, there are stronger connections for us to make so that we know who the author is. In Peter's Gospel, there is no name attached to the text itself, but the oldest sources that we have are in agreement, going back to the 200s. Just decades following the completion of the writing of the text of the New Testament. Everyone who mentions this gospel is in agreement, and I mean Papias, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, and Jerome. They all agree that Mark is the one who penned this gospel. And the two earliest sources, Papias and Irenaeus, associate Mark with Peter. And they say that Mark was writing down what he was hearing Peter preach, that he was making a record, a transcript of the gospel as presented by Peter when he preached the gospel. And we know from the New Testament that at the end of Peter's life there in Rome, Mark, who was originally associated with Barnabas and Paul, and then became very important in Paul's ministry, and by our best information came to Rome at the end before Paul died, or around the time Paul died, was there with Peter. Peter died in Rome shortly after Paul did. So there was a period of time between the death of Peter and the death of Paul in which some of Paul's men, helpers, staff, were now at the disposal of Peter and were helping Peter out. And Peter mentions Mark by name at the end of 1 Peter 5 in verse 13. So he's there as Peter's right-hand man, and it would have been very easy for him then to do exactly what the historical sources say that he did, to listen to what Peter was preaching and write it down. And so this is Mark's gospel, and I think he signs his name to it. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But it is almost certainly, according to our sources, the best sources, historical sources that we have, almost certainly Peter's gospel, the way Peter was preaching the gospel. So anyway, let's talk about Mark. Who is Mark? Mark is the nephew, kinsman of Barnabas. Mark is a resident of Jerusalem. His mother Mary has a house in Jerusalem and servants. So he's grown up a fairly well-off young man, maybe a very well-off young man. Barnabas and his family seem to be people of property. When Peter escapes prison, when the angel rescues him, and he ends up on the street in the middle of the night, and he's free, and he goes to Mary's house and knocks on the door. It's their household servant Rhoda that fails to answer the door for him in Acts chapter 12. In Acts chapter 13, when Paul and Barnabas go on their first missionary journey, they start out with John Mark. John Mark is with them, and that's his name, by the way. It's John called Mark. Sometimes we refer to him as John Mark. But anyway, they leave with him, but he doesn't stick it out for the entire missionary journey. And so when Paul and Barnabas are planning to go on a second missionary journey, and Barnabas wants to take Mark, Paul refuses to go with Mark because the way he was deserted by Mark earlier. And we're told about this in Acts chapter 15. At the end of Acts chapter 15, we're told that the tension between the two men was so thick that they decided to part ways, and that Barnabas went with Mark to Crete, and that Paul took Silas and went on the missionary journey with Silas. And so there for some time, and we don't know how much time, Mark was not associated with Paul's work. We don't know what happened with Barnabas, We don't have any really strong sources to know the end of his story. But we do know that eventually Mark became a necessary co-worker of Paul's, and he describes him as such. In the two letters that go to the church at Colossae, Colossians, of course, and then Philemon, which was addressed to a member of that congregation, Mark is mentioned as being with Paul in Rome when he's in jail, and being there serving him while he's in jail in Rome. I think that's probably while he's under house arrest, that jail sentence that we're told about at the end of the book of Acts. At some point, he's dispatched by Paul to do other work. But in 2 Timothy, at the end of 2 Timothy, when it's getting close to the end, and Paul needs Timothy to be there with him, and needs him to bring his coat, and needs him to bring his manuscripts and his books, he also says, you have to bring John Mark because he's necessary to my work. And so that's a sweet comment about how important this man is, and that even though his getting a little scared as a young man on the mission field happened, it didn't prohibit him from growing up and being necessary, and that Paul felt him felt that he was a necessary part of his team. And then we read of him in 1 Peter chapter 5 verse 13 as being there with Peter and necessary to Peter's work as well before Peter died. I've mentioned the signature, and I'm going to mention that to you. That's from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 14. This is a detail that's not in any other gospel, and it in no way enhances the text. It's just a detail, and there's no other reason for it to be there if it isn't a signature. And so in Mark chapter 14, verses 51 and 52, we're told this. This is when Jesus was arrested, and all the disciples fled. And it says, a certain young man was following him, wearing nothing but a linen sheet over his naked body. And they seized him, but he left the linen sheet behind and escaped naked. Why is that there in the text? If that's not Mark saying, listen, I was there, I'm an eyewitness too, and I followed in the darkness to the Garden of Gethsemane, and I saw what happened, and when they tried to take me, I had to run off naked to get back home. I really do think that is Mark's signature. He would have been the right age, and I don't know any other reason for those verses to be there. We're going to talk a little more about the characteristics of Mark tomorrow, and then we'll get into the text. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes.